you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to our kind of virtual roundtable addressing the massive displacements the Ukrainian war had unleashed and their effects within a global context. I'm Aisha Chalar. I am a permanent fellow at IWM, Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. We have a very interesting group of scholars whom I will introduce, albeit very briefly due to time constraints. Right now, we are still missing two of our panelists. I don't know what happened in terms of that joining. We are hoping that they will be able to join. And one of them, yes, it is exactly, yes, Alex. I wanted to introduce Alex Aleinkop, and he had joined. Alex Aleinkop is professor at the New School for Social Research and has served as the director of Zolberg Institute since January 2017. Aleinkop has written widely in the areas of immigration and refugee law and policy, transnational law, citizenship, race, and constitutional law, including legal case books on immigration law and forced migration. Since 2014, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As I told you, that I think everyone is interested in hearing our views rather than hearing the impressive publication records, so I'm not going into those ones. And Randall Hansen is director of Monk School Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, as well as the Global Migration Lab. He's professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and Canada Research Chair in Global Migration. Hansen works on immigration and citizenship, demography and population policy, and the effects of war on civilians. His publications cover a broad range of topics, and but as I said, I'm not going to enumerate them. Grozhnya Baranovska is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Hertie School in Berlin and an assistant professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is the principal investigator of a project which seeks to identify and interpret international legal obligations regarding missing migrants, casting a critical view on the practices of the EU, its member states, and the international organizations involved. And nevertheless, I will introduce Ranabir Shamadar. He might be having difficulties in connecting from Calcutta and hoping that he would join. Ranabir Shamadar is the distinguished chair in migration and forced migration studies at the Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group in Calcutta, India. He's the co-director of the Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration, anchored at the IWM, and this event is part of that research platform. And he's also the is at the Calcutta, as I said, in the Calcutta Research Group. He has written widely on migration, forms of labor, urbanization, and political struggles that have signaled a new turn in post-colonial thinking. Last but not the least, Olena Fedjuk is an anthropologist and a filmmaker working on gendered labor migration. She obtained her PhD from the Central European University with an ethnographic study of transnational moral economies, with particular focus on Ukrainian female labor migrants to Italy. Her current work also deals with transnational labor rights and the interface between gendered labor and care regimes, with a focus on mediated employment, focusing on the employment agencies. So as you see, we have a very, very interesting panel with very with the expertise, with research anchored in a very different points which could address the issues that we came up. Let me give you a little bit of kind of, I'm not going to repeat the note that I, about this event, which was disseminated, but start saying that I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is often seen to be pivotal in terms of its effects on the global order of power, on Europe's understanding of itself and its future, and on the location of Russia, among others. At IWM, we had several events focusing on these effects and on the meaning of the war, meanings of this war and for future. However, in today's roundtable, instead, we would like to scrutinize the unprecedented displacements this war unleashed in Europe since the World War II, and try to situate them within a global context and address the possible transformations they indicate for the future. Are they pivotal for the future? These kinds of massive displacements. So trying to look at it, this question of the pivotal role of the war in terms of effects from that angle. So though the Ukrainians fleeing the war refugees in daily languages, they're in our daily language, they are not officially recognized as refugees, but have temporary protection status. And this status allows them to enter EU member states and have access to rights in various aspects of their life, to labor market, education, health. This granted status raised right away the questions in some public debates and also in scholarship about the question of quote unquote unequal treatment of displaced groups, as this temporary protection status is in contrast to the restrictive border regimes many other recent forcefully displaced groups, such as those fleeing from the war in Syria and Afghanistan, were subject to in Europe. They might be subject to very different status in different places, but in Europe. Such comparisons about the treatment of the displaced tend to underline the quote-unquote unique or quote-unquote singular aspects of this displacement and emplacement of the Ukrainian quote-unquote refugees and of this war. And I would like to first give the floor to Alex Alainikov to address these claims. And Alex, as someone who has served as United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees and has a very broad and global perspective on forced displacements, where do you locate the commonalities the displaced from Ukraine share with the other groups of displaced in other parts of the world? If so, in what ways? And do you see any kind of a transformation in the way borders and humanitarian regimes are managed for the displaced? Or, so I'm asking, is there anything new on that front? And if there is a kind of a transformation in the making, what do they hint us for the future?
Okay, thank you, Aisha. Then thank you for inviting me to this panel, and I look forward to the comments of others here to learn from them. I'll speak, I guess, more generally, and you'll have more specific comments head on is describe more generally the international refugee regime and to what extent the Ukrainian situation may be affecting it, transforming it, we'll see. It's an odd time in the refugee world in terms of the mixed news, because you have this welcome of 6 or 7 million refugees, the largest refugee flow in years. At the same time that the United Kingdom is trying to send refugees asylum seekers to Rwanda, or in the US, you see a reversal by President Biden of Donald Trump's dramatic cut in refugee admissions, but the Biden administration keeping at the border these so-called Title 42 regulations, health regulations that permit the summary expulsion of anyone arriving at the border, nominally in the name of COVID protection, but really there to end asylum at the southwest border. And at the same, we see billions of dollars now raised for humanitarian relief, primarily for Ukraine, but that funding is skewed, so other important situations are ignored. And in any event, we now have 100 million displaced people in the world, according to the UNHCR most recent numbers. That includes IDPs, internally displaced people, as well as refugees. So a lot going in the world, a lot of cross signals here. So how does Ukraine fit into that? I'll start by saying something I think a bit counterintuitive for people, is that in some ways, the Ukraine situation shows the one significant way in which the refugee regime works well, and that's in providing initial safety to those who flee their homes. So we tend to focus on the disparate treatment, as you described, Aisha, in the initial response to asylum seekers from Ukraine, and also the different treatment between Afghans and Ukrainians in the EU. But actually, if you take a slightly different perspective, the international regime does respond pretty well to flight immediately across a border from danger to so-called countries of first asylum. So Syrians were able to get safety in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, and the Rohingya were able to go to Bangladesh. In the same way, Ukrainians are able to go to Poland and other European states. The difficulty is what happens after that, and that's the real challenge for the refugee regime. It's not clear that Ukraine will make a difference there, but I'll say a bit more about that. So the difficulty for the global north, for the EU, is this secondary flow from countries of first asylum, then coming to Europe. So there were very few Syrians who fled directly from Syria to the EU. They had fled 3 or 4 years of asylum in the bordering states, the neighboring states to Syria, where they had run out of money, run out of welcome, and look for some other place to go. I'll talk about mobility in a bit. There are some innovations in the Ukrainian response, and we'll see whether they carry forward, perhaps. The first is the role of private sponsorship. Typically resettlement of people has been a state-run function. The United States, Australia, Canada, generally the states, their ministries of foreign affairs or their migration folks will welcome people in, handle the resettlement, find them a place to live. Canada, for some years now, has a form of private sponsorship where groups of Canadians, Randall can talk more about this, welcome refugees, sometimes with some government help. What we see in the EU context is a massive role for private sponsorship. There weren't any refugee camps created as there are elsewhere around the world. There was some reception centers where people stayed for a few days or a week or two until they could go elsewhere, but really a very important role of private sponsorship. And this is also happening in the United States to some extent. So it's echoing trend here, where Afghan, well, they were refugees, but they came in under the parole process in the United States, not through refugee processing, but 70 or 80,000 Afghans came into the United States, and many of them were able to be privately sponsored. That is, they would be welcomed by private families, or even now in this fiscal year, there'll be the ability of private groups to bring refugees into the United States through the resettlement process. So that's something that we saw work pretty well so far. We'll have to see after 6 months or a year whether families continue to be willing to host Ukrainian families, but that's important. The second, I think, here is the role of mobility for refugees. So under the temporary directive that you alluded to, Aisha, this temporary protection directive, people coming to the EU are allowed to choose whatever country they want to get temporary protection. Now, once there, they're supposed to stay there and get permission to move elsewhere, but the EU countries have waived that, and generally people are able to move within the EU, which has been different than treatment for refugees in general and different for refugees around the world. The usual story for refugees is they flee their country of origin, they go next door, and they stay. And I've called this phenomenon the problem of the second exile, that refugees are forced out of their homes the first time, get to a country of first asylum, and then have nowhere to go. They can't go home because the conflict's not solved. They're not locally integrated into the economy and society where they are. And very, very few resettlement spots exist. So I've argued for a long time now that finding mobility for refugees can travel to a place where they can take care of themselves, start their lives over, be reunited with family, go to school, whatever, would be a major innovation for the refugee system. I don't think you'll see it globally, but you might see it regionally. And I think what you're seeing here in the context of the EU is a movement towards the recognition of the importance of mobility rights. Do I have 2 more minutes here? I should keep going.
Yes.
I want to stop here at this point.
No, you take your 2 minutes, please.
Okay. Yeah, just I've said nothing about human rights, and I know that's
Yeah.
part of the title here. And you know, this uneasy relationship between human rights and refugee law. They exist side by side. They overlap. They're concerned about similar issues, but they have quite different norms. They have quite different structures for their enforcement. And attempts have been made by scholars to kind of turn refugee law into applied human rights law. It hasn't been fully adopted. I don't think it's been fully successful. But I think there is a way that if we move refugee law beyond refugee law to a broader conception, a law of concern about forced migration in general, then we're going to have to bring human rights law in. We'll get beyond the narrow definition of refugee, now narrow definition in the 1951 convention that leaves a lot of people out. And so we could begin to talk, is there a human right to stay home that is violated either by conflict or violence, or more importantly, by climate change and other environmental events? Is there a human right not to be returned to danger? This is the principle of non-refoulement, so crucial to refugee law, but it applies in refugee law only to people who meet this definition of refugees. You can show well-founded fear of persecution on narrow grounds for return. It doesn't protect people being forced from their homes for human rights abuse, or more importantly, again, for climate change or other kinds of environmental events. And then thirdly, could there be a human right to mobility, which I've just described? These changes will come through an application of a broader notion of human rights law. Jane McAdam has argued this in the climate situation, and we'll have a difficult time emerging from refugee law. So that's how I see the overlap here. But you know, to say that, it's obviously a tough time for human rights. Who's going to make these human rights interventions? Courts, institutions, scholars, politics. It's probably politics in the end. So because the last point, because a classic refugee situation, an invading army forcing people out of their homes, no question these folks are refugees, you actually don't see a transformation of the system in an important way in terms of broadening the definition to a law of forced migration. But you may see these other smaller interventions that I've pointed to.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. That is, I mean, maybe we see that there and broadens. Let me now turn to Randall Hansen. In the second round, I would really ask you to also interact and then respond to the among the panelists too. And let me now ask Randall, by adopting a legal framework allowing Ukrainians flowing Ukraine to cross EU national borders, EU had really showed a very coordinated performance in terms of, especially in relation to the 2015 quote unquote refugee crisis. Alex had already indicated within the border, but also the changes within the EU. What kind of light does the Ukraine war reckon on the changing nature of the borders. It, especially, you could say, I mean, take it within the EU, within Europe, but also elsewhere. And then I have also, because you have worked on the post-Second World War narratives, I would like you, I mean, to comment on that the cultural narratives that have been evoked in various ways in relation to the displaced, the differentiated inclusions, humanitarianism, but also in framing the exclusions. So it is not only about that the particular groups inclusion. So how do you locate those kind of quote unquote cultural civilizational narratives that surface through the war, and how does the 2015 refugee crisis figure in these narratives and the imaginaries? So however you would like to take that, these are the 2 points that I would like to raise, and one of them follows right after directly from what Alex was also saying.
Great. Well, thank you, Aisha, and very nice to see everyone here. Very nice to be on this panel. I'll pick up on what Alex said, and I have to say I fundamentally agree. The response that you've seen on Twitter, in the press, and so on, suggesting that there's something fundamentally different about the Ukrainian refugee crisis, seems to me to get it entirely wrong. To paraphrase Freymark, there's nothing new in the West here. The origins of the refugee crisis, as Alex said, are like most refugee crises. You have an invasion, war. The vast majority of refugees flee not persecution in the traditional 1930s German Jewish professor being thrown out of university sense, but rather they flee invading armies. That's exactly what happened here. What Poland, what Romania, what Slovakia did was exactly what Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan did. It's what every country does. When you're a contiguous country to a massive refugee-producing country, and refugees are coming to you en masse, you have 2 choices. You open the border, or you open fire. And almost every country always opens the border. So Alex has said that, I agree entirely. So what does that mean for borders, differential treatment? Well, on the issue of borders, on the one hand, we've had a massive reconfiguration in the sense that Russia has unilaterally violated, for the first time since 1945, a border in the sense of attempting to change borders through force. Most European countries have opened their borders. On the other hand, we are fighting this war for many reasons. One of them is to maintain the sanctity of the Ukraine-Russia border. So we're seeing a complex collapse yet reinforcement of borders. There's one last comment on this, the Syrians before I move on to civilizational discourse. Let's not forget that the status that the Ukrainians are receiving is actually less generous than the full refugee status that the Syrians received. They've got 3 years of temporary protection, not full refugee status, which was accorded chiefly by Germany, Sweden, and also Austria to 1.2 million Syrians. So again, the claim that Ukrainians are being treated so much better, well, there's a logic to that. They're certainly being welcomed in Poland in the way that the Syrians were not, but legally there are also problems with that. Last comment on the civilizational discourse. The most obvious way in which this is emerging is with reference to the enemy, Russia. There is a great tendency among commentators to essentialize Russia as inherently imperialist, inherently expansionist, inherently eliminationist, murderous, and so on. And goodness, where have we heard that before? That was exactly the same sort of discourse we had in the 1930s and the 1940s about the Germans. And parochially, the response to that at the European Center, which I've literally just stopped directing, but was until a few days ago, was to call for an end to all cooperation with Russia and Russians. And as ever in the case of academic boycotts, I oppose that, because the last thing we should do is to stop talking to our colleagues. Good, I've said enough, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, this is exactly actually I was hinting at in terms of how the exclusions are also that put in those kind of the narratives where that the most of the attention is that, I mean, this cultural religious proximity discussions also abound in media, in the public debates, where the kind of quote unquote unequal treatment or singularity of that treatment, and then one loses, and it has all the perspective on that those exclusions and what kind of an effect it would have on language, on culture, and that those kinds of the programs, and then making the enemy in a very essentialized way. I think recently Etienne Balibar talked about that the Russophobia, that it is in a way inflicting, of course, if you invade a country and with that kind of autocracies that happening, that takes place. In relation to your that, I will just underline one point in terms of course, the neighboring countries, the first candidates, as that in that sense, nothing on that front, but also it is not simply opening the borders or firing them, because of that Turkey was a border to Iraq and is border to Iraq and Syrians, and the way that the borders were open were very different in terms of they were not fired, but they were open, but then what it meant. Also, I think it's very important to underline that the temporary protection actually is not everything, that robs certain rights as from the refugee status. So it is very important, I think. This is what we are seeing also in Turkey. Let me turn to Grozny now, and with the borders issue, the Polish border plays a kind of a specific role in the imaginaries and then in terms of the discussions, because it remains open for the Ukrainian displaced, but there are also thousands of displaced fleeing from wars elsewhere that are struck from the Belarus Polish border. Of course, they did not come directly from the neighboring country. And so how is this simultaneous openness and closure of the borders to the forcefully displaced enacted in laws? How do you how could, and I know that you with your legal expertise, so where do you see that kind of the kind of detentions and how they are anchored in the laws, and how do those borders figure for the displaced non-Ukrainian citizens from Ukraine? So that's the called the third country nationals fleeing from Ukraine. And the last I would like to ask you that is, I mean, we know that the many NGOs are in the borders assisting the displaced, and how does this kind of the very complex structure of the Polish borders mean for the NGOs working for the displaced?
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you, Alexandrano, for your comments. I think it's there's really a lot going on here. So let me start with responding shortly to our last question, and then I will jump to two things. Firstly, I would like to point to one uniqueness of the Ukrainian situation, which is probably more an EU uniqueness than a refugee uniqueness. And secondly, I will more closely look into kind of situate the Ukraine refugee situation against the humanitarian crisis at the Belarusian EU border. the Polish border has been really in the lights of the attention for the last year. So the eastern border, there's 400 kilometers with Ukraine, 500 with Belarus. So it's a really long border, and they're basically the same NGOs often at both borders, and at one they're intimidated and they're not allowed to help at the Belarusian border, and the same people are really cherished for the work that they have been doing at the Ukrainian border and in Poland itself for Ukrainian refugees. And this is kind of really an example that which also nobody has been prosecuted yet, but charges have been brought against people that have helped at the Belarusian border. So I think it really shows the tension, which is really a tension in one specific country more than showing something about the general refugee law perspective. So now moving on to this one uniqueness of the situation. And as I said, this is really EU related. So the fact that Ukrainian refugees were able, and as she said in the beginning, that's how I use the word refugees in this presentation, but why Ukrainians and people fleeing the war from Ukraine were able to enter the European Union is the fact that they did not have to apply for a visa. And this is something that was in the law even long before the war. So it did not start with the war. And I think that gave the European Union a totally different perspective, because the main issue for refugees and refugee seekers is to reach the European Union. There are even countries from which the acceptance rate is 100% in some European countries, but they have virtually no way to enter the EU regularly. And the prime example is Eritrea. So the only way for them to reach safety in the European Union is to engage in a life-threatening, extremely dangerous route, and once they reach the European Union, they have safety and support. So this is really a situation that the European Union policies have left those people with. And this is not the situation that Ukrainians were left with, because they could just enter the European Union. So actually what the European Union was deciding upon after February 24th is not whether or not to close the border, because they were allowed to enter before as well. It was what to do once the people have entered. So that was more kind of, and of course for the third country nationals, that was a bit different, but the situation was fundamentally different for the European Union. So what I would wish actually that this situation would, in a European context, trigger would be firstly a discussion about extending visa-free traveling to other countries, because it really shows that this is the better and easier response to crisis as well. And secondly, discuss not have to die when they flee war or persecution. I mean, we really need to repeat that, because people are not dying when they're fleeing war in the Ukraine, and that should hold true also for other countries, but it doesn't. So this brings me to comparing the situation at the two Polish borders, to Ukraine and Belarus. And I think Poland is a really interesting case study, also because the Polish perspective from 2015, where Poland was really at the forefront of European Union countries opposing refugee relocation and having a lot of anti-refugee and anti-migrants trends in the country. And that came up again last year during the situation at the Polish-Belarusian border. And what I call the humanitarian crisis was first initiated by Lukashenko's regime that brought people to the border, but it was actually also activated by the response of the Polish state that pushed them back. So under domestic and international law, they should have looked up their, for those of them that wanted to file refugee applications, they should have been looked at, but they were not. So the practice on the ground was just pushing them back, and then that was very quickly grounded in domestic law within a couple of weeks, and many other legal aspects as well. So there was a state of emergency until recently, which made it impossible for journalists and humanitarian help to enter the area. There was also widespread intimidation of human rights defenders and of humanitarian workers. So this is really a number of things also legally that were taking place. And with regard to Ukraine, the Polish state has also responded really quickly, also in a legal way, by adopting a law that gives the Ukrainian refugees in Poland really strong support. So they have healthcare, the same as Polish citizens, access to education, access to childcare benefits. So this is the situation of people fleeing the Ukraine war is actually, in Poland at least, substantially much better than of other refugees. And this is due to this one law that was really enacted in the first days of the war happening. So what I found, so we see those two legal frameworks with regard to the Belarus border that was really adopted in response to that, and to the Ukraine refugees really to response to that are in strong opposition. And what I also find quite troubling is that there's huge support for both of those policies. And I've recently came across research by Krawczyk and Goldstein on the situation in Poland. And what they're saying is that 75% of young Poles are supportive of the pushbacks against Belarus, and 90% of young Poles are supportive of the Polish state's policies with regard to Ukrainian refugees. So you would see really opposite politics and strong support on the ground with regard to those policies.
Okay, thank you very much, Grotner. This is a fascinating. I mean, I find the case with Poland, and then these kind of those regulations of the legal frameworks that they're anchored. What you're explaining is very interesting, but it's very. I mean, it shows the complex. But in relation to that, what you were saying, that in Poland, the Ukrainians that they have is in terms of they are better off than the refugees in terms of the rights, that the benefits. And I think this is in many other places too. For example, if I look at it in Turkey, that's access to health, access to education, access to childcare, whatever that is there, but they do not have access to for resettlement then for somewhere else as that kind of the refugee rights. And I think this is that creates also different kinds of tensions, I mean, in the countries, and obviously not yet in Poland, that what you're referring to, the Poles. And I find also very important that the kind of the visa-free traveling possibilities and not facilitating not to die on the routes, very important. I think that something came up that the Ranabir is not there, so I'll just move immediately to Olena. What I would ask is that highlight is that the distributive schemes often go together with moral hierarchies and representations. And these kind of the rights that we are talking about are also, they are distributive schemes. Among others, the permeability of the EU borders stood on constructions of distinctions between deserving refugees, quote unquote, refugees, and undeserving economic migrants. And these juxtapositions are more complex in relation to the Ukrainians in Europe, because Ukraine has a very long history of out-migration, displacement, exile. I'm not talking about all those historical patterns, but since 1991, that the Ukrainians were especially migrants were in many different countries of Europe and in the care sector. And we are very fortunate to have Olena here, because her work addressed the care workers in Italy, and also that in the employment agencies, the Ukrainians were in the service industries as the laborers. So there were Ukrainian migrants in various countries in Europe. And I would like to ask you, how are these migrants anchored in the current narratives, but not the narratives, more in terms of the programs, the assistance programs vis-a-vis the displaced, the currently displaced. So because the others were under the kind of the economic migrants in a way, and some of them were undocumented. And now we have very different groups of Ukrainians, displaced Ukrainians actually in Europe. And then also what happens to their rights, access to rights? What happens to them in relation to the newcomers? And last but not the least, that we all know from migration scholarship also that the former migrants provide very valuable networks for the newcomers. So how do you see that kind of the situation? Of course, you are free to expand whichever part of the panel, but what kind of collaborations, but also tensions, if there are, in that relation. So yours, Alina.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aisha, and thank you all the panelists for this really stimulating and really broad and very kind of solid introduction into the topic. I would like to add maybe a slightly different perspective also to the original question, right? What is different and what might be different, or one of the things that contribute to a particular practical situation that we see unfolding in terms of reception of people who flee the war in Ukraine. And this is exactly what Aisha has mentioned. It's a tremendous, long and numerous history of labor migration. So since 1991, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and opening of the Iron Curtain, right, we had various imaginable and enumerated in all migration studies forms of mobility for mostly economic reasons, which were labeled as labor migration, right? So we had shuttle migration, we had short-term migration, we had long-term migration, we had migration for settlements. These waves, you know, in terms of demographics, you know, we had country destinations with equal kind of migration, younger migration, older migration. We have quite unequal countries like the Southern welfare model of countries who rely really, really heavily on the female labor in terms of, you know, reproducing their society, either through care work or through domestic work. So we had all forms and shapes and colors, you know, of this mobility that was growing and maturing and developing in the last 30 years, with different nation states establishing their different particular connections and particular relationship to Ukraine, specifically through the groups of migrants that they were receiving. And what I wanted to say is that I mentioned that it was labeled as a labor migration and an economic migration. And one thing which is very often overlooked in this perspective is that this migration was happening in response to tremendous geopolitical shifts. And all of these shifts, not only in terms of you know, political economy, but also in terms of social structures, in terms of cultural structures that Aisha was mentioning, in terms of ideologies. All of these waves and all of these shifts, they haven't been staying in Ukraine. I mean, these people, they have been taking them abroad. They've been enriching in different ways, sometimes very difficult ways, their own perspective on these things, and they have been engaging back with Ukraine through either particular forms of investment or quite direct political action. And this is what I wanted to highlight here, that many times in connection with Ukrainian migration, especially in terms of the agenda of research of migration studies, this impact of Ukrainian migration on transnational political participation, the forms of transnational political participation are often undermined, even though we have very excessive evidence, extreme political mobilization during all the periods of crisis, be it the Orange Revolution, you know, when people were organizing, irregular migrants were organizing buses in order to take people to the voting polls and having protests, you know, in the receiving countries, on the squares of the receiving countries, whether we've seen this also in Maidan, tremendous mobilization in terms of, again, political action, informing the local communities, influencing the politics of the nation state through even, you know, through engaging with the municipal politics, with the local politics directly, but also, of course, tremendous support to the Ukrainian state and various actors in the Ukrainian state through donations, volunteering, supporting particular initiatives financially and in other ways. And I think this brings me to the current situation. One thing which I wanted to emphasize more from an anthropological perspective is that we have to remember that the war, Russian war on Ukraine has fragmented tremendously the experiences of mobile people. I mean, this is something that we have to keep in mind. People with absolutely different backgrounds, goals, life trajectories have been displaced and been set on the move. But I think the same rule applies as with every mobility. We have to remember that the first people who can move are those who can actually afford to move. And this can have various forms and shapes, but in this particular mobility, I would like to emphasize that these were the people who had this exactly the social capital and these networks that Aisha was referring to that that got on the move. So this is not based on any particular numerical research, but just from my experience of volunteering the first couple of months here in Budapest. Literally, the most frequent phrase that I had to translate for the people who were arriving is like, I don't want a sandwich, help me to buy a ticket somewhere. You know, everyone was going somewhere. Everyone, in the first 2 months, everyone knew where they were going. And of course, if we look at the, you know, UNHCR numbers and everything, so the number of people who move to different countries very often kind of just mirror the previous numbers of the labor migration that already existed in this country. And I want to be very quick. One is what I said, is the tremendous role and political activism of the people, of labor migrants, you know, who are often portrayed as apolitical, but their tremendous role in supporting this mobility. Because yes, Europe has opened the borders, and a lot of local initiatives have provided initial relief, so the kind of a catastrophe relief, what my colleagues were mentioning before. But it's really, there already exist in networks of labor migrants that have received the main financial and social and moral pressure in terms of receiving these people and settling these people. So from just several examples of the people that I work with and follow through my research, you know, I would have people who, for example, work as care workers in Italy, you know, they have brought their mother, daughter, and grandchildren to Italy. So now they have found them accommodation, they have agreed with their employers, they have managed to find a way to settle them. But, you know, on top of all of that, they still have to work. And besides just being now by themselves, they have to support another 4 people. And besides that, they have to support those people which have stayed back in Ukraine who could not be mobile. But they still need a support. To emphasize with this is that these networks that were many times already asymmetrical, as we know from the migration literature, where the care flows in one direction towards the families more than towards the migrants, they have received even much more pressure now in these days, where they really became responsible for just so many things. And the last point which I wanted to say is that it also revealed the kind of the real ugly face of the labor migration regimes, because all these workers who were, be it a care worker who could be a caring worker, you know, for 24/7 and live in the family in the receiving country, all of a sudden, with the arrival of their own family, the moment their reproduction of their personal life and their family life could not be separated by the migration regime, could not be outsourced to someone else in Ukraine, the moment they have received these families, they could not work so diligently anymore. And we see the same thing happening here in Hungary, where most employment goes through temporary work agencies and ends up in the in the factories, and workers living in the dorms, taking 12-hour shifts, weekend shifts, all of these things. With the arrival of their family, they found level of diligent work, why migrants, all of a sudden they can't be that, because these regimes of intensive exploitation for short period of time, they're not sustainable with any form of life balance. They're not sustainable, and they can be maintained if they're not happening at the expense of the outsourcing this to some other place, where the cheaper care labor is happening elsewhere. And just the very final short point is that these people find themselves, from a legal perspective, also in a lot of trouble, because those people who have arrived on short-term stays also have arrived with the biometric passports, 90 days permit to enter and stay. When their status expires, they find themselves really in between. They can't apply for the temporary protection status because they came before the war, but they also cannot renew their work permits. So I think that there is what my colleagues from this panel have been mentioning. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of the long-term and understanding of an incorporation of these people.
Thank you very much, Olena, for this. I mean, actually expanding on the complexity of the situation. At one point, that is really, there is nothing new in terms of that what happens to if you cannot outsource the social reproduction, how it comes, and those on the changes or burdens the responsibilities of those migrants, and then how that who could move and who could not move, the asymmetries there again played out in this case too, but also the use of the social capital and the networks, and then how the migrants, no matter whether they were called refugees or the economic migrants, they're part of those transnational political fields. I think Randall was raising his hand, so let me give the floor to Randall. Was it a mistake? Sorry?
It was a mistake. I was just trying to read one of the chat.
So if it is a mistake, so let me say that, I mean, I don't think that Rana Beer will be able to join us. What I would do is that I will just a kind of throw one question, if whoever would like to pick that up, or if you want, you could respond or expand or bring another issue in relation to what the other panelists said, because I think that everyone showed from a very different, I mean, in some kinds of in the agreements, but also showed the complexities from very different angles, and sometimes that the uniqueness where it lies and where it looks like that the kind of the singularity, it is not that kind of no singularity at all. I will just want to throw that one question, if you are completely free to pick it up or not, but the Ukrainian war has had a kind of a cohesive role for Europe and European values. It is so underlined very often to go beyond the cultural divides within. But also one could see that it also brought possible other kinds of divides that apart from what Olena was also referring to in relation to global South and the global North, in terms of the reactions, in terms of insistence on keep the neutrality, to be neutral vis-a-vis the economic war waged through coordinated sanctions. So some of the global South countries had a very different position vis-a-vis this war. If you, I mean, whether or not you would like to comment on that, or if you think that this is, there is not that kind of a divide. And the second one is that the nationalism and the anti-colonial acquired a prominence in political debates now. And then the nature of nationalism, what kind of nationalisms are being developed, and then usually colonialism is very much brought into the picture in relation to the, of course, to the Russian. Would you like to say something, whether it is, how do you see that in relation to that, the this N word being again into in a different form in the discussions, and then the colonialism and the global South and global North discussion? If you would like to pick that, anything from there, or any kind of question or point that was raised by the panelists that you would like to comment or expand on that before we open it to the questions from our audience. Is there anyone who would like to pick this global South, and then the position of the global South in vis-a-vis this, the war, and then the colonialism? Yes, Randall?
Yeah, thanks. I'd also like to respond to Krasna's excellent comments on Poland. I think that's absolutely right. And in this debate, where we're seeing an incredibly sharp contrast between the approach to the Syrians and the approach to the Ukrainians, that really only works well in the case of Poland. In the case of Germany, there were 1.2 million Syrians, exactly the same people who 7 years ago went down to Munich and Berlin Hauptbahnhof with their welcome refugee signed. They were there for the Syrians, they're back again. And again, here, Germany is very interestingly being once again a country for secondary movements. So the 700,000 who are in Germany now, a few trickled in immediately, but in the main, they're people who first went to Poland or to Romania and then have moved on. In the case of Poland, it's your country, your research, but it is absolutely striking, those numbers. I would have thought, and I would ask you, you've had 7 years of a government peace that has demonized Muslims, demonized refugees, tried to redefine Poland as a defender of Christianity and indeed Catholicism, though those very good Catholics are terribly happy to ignore what the Pope says on refugees. In that context, the state leads public opinion. I can't imagine those attitudes are separate from the government that we've had, that you've had for the last 7 years. And if Civic Platform had been there, I wonder if the situation wouldn't be different.
Yes, Krasna.
Okay, so that's I guess it's a long question, and also I'm not a political scientist, so this comes from my personal opinion. One of the reasons the peace won the first elections 7 years ago was their campaign, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim campaign. So I think it's also important to highlight that there was already support in society for those views before they came into power. So it's not just the nationalistic policies of peace that have made society that much in favor of such policies. Those sentiments were there also before, and that's how they got elected. So there were really ugly spots in 2015 that led to the election of peace. However, I do believe that, I mean, there is a almost total conquer of public media, and there is a public television which is broadcasted in most homes in Poland. It is clear that they do have the platform to speak to the majority of Poles and impose their opinion on various subjects. I do think it is still necessary to say that those anti-immigrant sentiments were there also before 2015, and that's also one of the reasons why peace is in power. So I wouldn't be that confident about the civic platform leading a totally different policy in Poland than is happening now, especially since pushbacks are a new thing not even a new thing, but the way that pushbacks are conducted in Poland are a new thing for this part of the border, but they're happening in many other places of European Union borders. So it's not a new phenomenon to the European Union. I think this is kind of, without like whitewashing this party that really has a very bad, horrible narrative, I think it's important to see it like in a broader context. And I see that there's another question which I'm not able to read now, but I've read in the chat the question on the temporary protection and whether there is an understanding that the protection of Ukraine and all the legal regulations are temporary. So at least from a regulatory view, they're temporary. Also, the polls that have been done, at least Polish people expect Ukrainians, the refugees, to leave after the war. So this is kind of but practically, I think that goes back to what Olena said. This is really like once the refugees get a job in the countries that they're residing, or any form of, history has shown people that have fled the war don't always go back. And I think this is also what will be expected after this war. And I've seen the networks, and really what Olena has mentioned is really visible right now in Poland, where there were 1 million Ukrainians before the war started. So it was the first ones that were hosting people, and then of course Poles as well. But this is really kind of the driving force especially during the first weeks. And I do have some other comments. Oh, one thing that I felt that is really important for me to mention is that it's not that I'm critiquing that the Ukrainian refugees in Poland are now receiving so many rights. I just think that it shows the political will, and it kind of shows the two differences kind of granting and more. And I absolutely agree with Randall that it's very Poland specific, and that the situation with Ukrainian refugees is not that different in other European Union countries. But I think as for Central Eastern Europe, that was not really addressed with the situation today is very unique, and for many reasons.
Okay, thank you very much, Grażyna. I will give the floor to Randall, to you, but I just wanted to also underline that this kind of this openness and opening impressive hospitality and then the willingness to take the displaced, that the Ukrainian refugees could also go together with the anti-immigrant and the xenophobic ideas and the sentiments. So it does not really cancel each other, and that was also kind of the antagonizing points in many places, but also these things also change in time. The ones they start working, the ones, that is what also Alex was saying, that I mean, not only in the beginning, but then afterwards, what happens and how these people were once they are in place in the labor market, once they are in place in that, what happens to them. Yes, Randall? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, got it. One comment on that. Yes, there was perhaps a false hope among Ukrainians and among host countries that their stay would be temporary, and that's partly why the TP directive was adopted. But there's also a more prosaic reason. It was happening, and now, and so they needed a mechanism to cope with it, and it was simply they were able to pull out this old temporary protection directive that was created in 2001 for refugees from Kosovo, and boom, apply it. if you had to get an EU directive or, God help us, agreement among the 27 members of the European Union, that's inevitably a lengthy process. So there was simply kind of a legal expedience to that. Other comment, again, I don't want to give the impression that I'm whitewashing this in another sense. There, of course, African would-be refugees are being beaten back at the borders of Spain while Ukrainians are being welcomed en masse. There is a contrast here. For the ones who there's not a contrast in the sense that Syrians got a more generous legal status. In a sense, it's not massively surprising that there's a greater cultural affinity for an intra-European refugee movement than there is a secondary movement. Morally and legally, there should be no distinction, but there is one. If a civil war, in fact, breaks out in the United States, which seems at least 50-50 possible, and massive numbers of American refugees pour across the border into Canada, they would receive a warmth of a welcome that Syrian refugees do not in Canada. I mean, this isn't terribly surprising. And in a sense, after the Kosovo refugees, the Ukrainian refugees are almost poster people for the perfect refugees. You have this mad dictator that invaded. All the men were told they had to stay in flight. Those crossing the border are in the main elderly, women, children. I mean, you couldn't construct a refugee crisis more perfectly to elicit public sympathy.
Thank you very much, Randall. Is there anyone who would like to add, or could we go to the questions? I mean, actually, one question, this is whether they would return or not, that has been responded. Is there anyone who would, among you, yes, Ed, Olena, yes?
Just a question of return. I wanted to quote the research on internally displaced and in generally displaced by war people by a Ukrainian think tank called TSADOS. So you can look it up for yourself. They put together all kinds of data from different sources, and they quote a study that says that 77% of those who fled and were, hope to return, or they want to return. 13 do not want to return. This is, I mean, as Grażyna was saying, that these things change. Obviously, everything is very dynamic, and also we have, since about the 10th of May, we have the numbers of people going back to Ukraine is higher than those leaving Ukraine. And also, having said that, just because you asked these questions about the return, these are just some thoughts, but I would encourage everybody to be very careful about these numbers, because we really don't know what these numbers mean. We don't know who returns, for how long they return, why they return. As simple fact as that it's summer, it's agricultural season, it's easier to travel. All these, I mean, there are endless reasons why people would go back and for how long they go back. And so we have to be very careful about the return. And I wanted to a little bit contradict on just 2 points. I think what Randall mentioned earlier, that, once people get into EU, they are not treated differently. I would argue against this, because we see consistently that non-Ukrainian citizens are having incredible difficulties and rejected over and over, virtually on no basis. They are encouraged to return, especially to Africa, to other countries where they're from. So even within here, I think it is from the practices of the state and the immigration offices that we see. I think it is not a question that it is, that it has to do with racism, colonialism, and this kind of a vision. And I just wanted to add a word of caution on the term of calling the sanctions as a kind of an economic war or something like this. I would just like to express my personal opinion that I think in this current context, I think it can turn out quite diminutive to compare, to use the same word war for something that is happening in Ukraine, and to say that the sanctions which are applied to the Russian state are also a war. So I would just raise a word of caution there. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Olena. That in terms of course, that the return is always at one point, as is people usually not return, but what does that the return means is that is also very ambiguous, because people go back and forth, and then I mean, for the neighboring countries also, from the Syrians, that in Turkey that one had seen that kind of the dynamics very well. In relation to the non-Ukrainian, I'm glad that you're bringing that up, that the non-Ukrainians fleeing from Ukraine, that is left to the states, nation states, their own capacity. So that is how, for example, in terms of access to education, the students that who were in Ukraine and fled in Germany, they cities, but in Austria, definitely not. That is there are the signs, unless they have changed it very recently, you have to be a Ukrainian citizen as a kind of a third country national and international student in Ukraine and fled the war, that you do not have to, and you have to go back actually in terms of residency. And one question in terms of that, the weaponization of the sanctions, that is why I was using it, that is being discussed quite a lot. Of course, it is not a kind of the same war that the kills, but also way the people are bringing also in relation to the global south with the famine, also that would be killing, has that kind of effect. So, but of course it is not just that the kind of killing the person in the same way. Randall?
I absolutely take on Elena's qualification, and that's an important corrective. I would say, though, that at least formally, third country nationals fleeing Ukraine have been offered temporary protection. In the case of Canada, they have not. So you may come to Canada as a Ukrainian national and apply for visa, but if you're not Ukrainian, you have zero access to Canada. So even if it's formally breaking down, it's at least formally in practice. And I would just point out again, this is nothing terribly new. Palestinians who were fleeing the Syrian civil war found themselves turned back at the border in Turkey and in Lebanon and Jordan. So this is, and on the issue of war, I wonder if the burden of Elena's comment wasn't that we're playing into Putin's hands by calling the sanction a war, in the sense that this can feed a narrative of the West enveloping and attacking Russia. And you're right about hunger, but the starvation that will occur, and it will occur, is again almost exclusively Russia's fault.
But Russians, yes,
and disrupting supply lines. Yeah.
Of course, no, definitely. I'm not trying to say that it is really, we should buy into that rhetoric, but especially from the global south, that was a very strong point in terms of the weaponization of the sanctions and the militarization of the sanctions. I think we have some questions that were from the audience that we need to take them. I think for return, we have dealt with that. From Yulia Bidenko, many thanks to speakers for presentation and discussion. My question addressed to those panelists who probably have such information or personal experience like Dr. Fedu. Are there data on the regional origin of the current Ukrainian migrants? is there some disproportion between representatives of the eastern and western part of Ukraine among those Ukrainians fled the EU? Because in Ukraine, this topic is getting stereotyped and speculated. And then let me, okay, Olena, would you like to respond to this, or should I collect all the questions? But maybe you could respond to this one because it's very specific and directed to you.
Yes, I just wanted to again recommend, I don't know, from the name, maybe Yulia reads Ukrainian. You can go to this study which just came out in June, and they do have some statistics about the number of people from different regions, and it's mostly internally displaced people from the eastern region, less so from the south. And I think that also has a very, direct impact in terms of how the warfare was done, in terms of which places were cut off. As we all know, the main problem with mobility was not to leave Ukraine. The main problem with mobility was and remains for people to move within Ukraine for various reasons. So you can look at the study on the internally displaced and people fleeing Ukraine from the think tank. You can leave it in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Ukraine. And Raj Bardui, many thanks for excellent presentations. In view of the fact that most European countries are experiencing a demographic deficit, the Ukrainian refugees could be seen as a way to fill in some of labor shortages. Do you see this as also as a factor for a warm reception for Ukrainians? So, and then he again has another question. Does the Ukrainian experience suggest a greater role for in hosting the displaced? I think we have touched the second one partly, but in terms of the labor shortages and in terms of, I mean, the Ukrainians were already in certain industries very much desired. Is there anyone who would like to pick that up? I mean, maybe one who would like to pick this up. Randall?
I think the answer is no, or only directly and indirectly, and this goes to Elena work. The fact that you had a large Ukrainian labor market diaspora allowed for the more rapid incorporation of Ukrainian refugees and might have created more sympathy in the sense if you've got a nice Ukrainian worker, you think about their family. But I think there's no, European publics are not thinking about the labor, the demographic deficit, and this is a solution to it. And if they are, they're bloody selfish because Ukraine has an even more serious demographic deficit, and you would simply be imposing a greater problem on Ukraine, a country that has enough of them. Where it did come in was in the case of the Syrians, not that it motivated Merkel's decision to allow them to come. A, it wasn't her alone. B, they were coming anyway. But what the German government did say internally at the time is, well, this could have an upside in that we're facing a serious demographic, people with high birth rates coming. But again, that was more making the best, seeing the positive in the situation that was happening anyway, rather than motivating it. One quick comment, I'll leave that for Alex, that's his area. But on the issue of resettlement, which he raised before, the Canadian model is no model because it just doesn't produce the numbers. You're looking at about 15,000 people a year, a long process of vetting, all sorts of requirements that needs to be fulfilled. What the Germans in particular did which was to have the most unbureaucratic form of resettlement. Literally, Berlin Station, people turn up. We have a family of 3. We need someone who speaks French. Hand up. We have a family of 4. English is fine, another hand up. I mean, that was the most rapid form of, well, in a sense, it wasn't resettlement in that they moved themselves, but it followed resettlement, the pattern of resettlement, in the sense that domestic actors took over the costs of incorporation. And that was an extraordinary development in the case of Germany. But Alex knows much more.
Well, no, I would just comment on the regional cooperation point that I think this will be used as I think the Ukrainian situation will be used as an example of how regional cooperation might work. And I contrast it to the attempt to, during the Syrian crisis, to get an agreement in the EU just to parcel out asylum seekers. And that was rejected by the Eastern European states. And now you had this wide, again, under the temporary protection directive, no right to move, but it's been interpreted as to permit movement. And you also see an echo of this in the United States just put together what was called the Los Angeles Declaration, with a range of countries in the Western Hemisphere, which looks to kind of create a regional asylum process. But more than that, to undertake regional migration flows. So if a lot of Salvadorans and Hondurans are coming to the US for dangerous because they fear flows based on labor movement, that gets back, really relates these two questions in a way that it separate out those people fleeing persecution and fear and those people seeking to move for work. And I think it was really interesting what Elena said, that people tended to move to those countries in the same proportions that workers had already been in those countries from Ukraine. And this again goes kind of an expansion of the way we think about forced migration beyond the narrow definition, but moving towards these kind of regional arrangements that realize that these causes of movement are quite complicated, and you need a range of structures, some temporary protection, some refugee protection, some labor migration and the like, to help parcel out the responsibility. Last point on this is what has destroyed the international refugee regime and made it a place that simply keeps refugees where they are is a lack of a responsibility sharing system around the world or even regionally. And if the Ukrainian situation kind of is seen as evolves into an example of responsibility sharing through the secondary movement, which has been accepted for Ukrainians but not for Syrians, that might.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Then I give you the floor to Grajnia, and then afterwards we have another question. Yes, Grajnia.
So this has been really interesting, what the voices right now, and I just wanted to shortly follow up on two issues. So firstly, with regard to the labor market, I do not think that this has been really kind of in the narrative, but from the other side of the coin is that the Ukrainian refugees are treated as people that are going to support themselves. So it's really kind of on the basis, it's with other refugees, they're very often put into refugee camping. They're not allowed to support themselves. So this is also, I'm not saying that's good, but they're not allowed to work. And with the Ukrainian refugees, and that is a difference in most of the countries, it's great that they're at private homes, but they're at private homes for a short time, and then they're in an apartment. And that puts vulnerable people, persons with disabilities that have more children, that might not have a job back in Ukraine, in a really difficult situation. So I think this is, when we think about the labor market and how the Ukrainian refugees have been treated, this is also something that we should bear in mind, that they're actually treated as laborers. That's kind of how the system has treated them. And the second follow-up, I really loved what Randall, you said about the train station. Those were amazing pictures, by the way. And this is the same what happened in Poland. And it kind of comes back to one of the first points I've made, that it's much easier to help once they get into the European Union. And the main issue for most of the refugee seekers so far is that they do not get to the situation where they can be supported. So it's kind of, for the majority population in the European Union or in Canada, it's once they are here, it's easier to help, but it's also more comfortable kind of to accept policies to keep them out. So I think this is really about getting in is a lot of the discussion that, to me, I wish that the Ukraine refugee crisis would have triggered more, and I don't see much of the discussion about getting in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gražina. And in terms of the labor, that I would just like to add that I agree that I don't think that it is just the narrative in terms of, especially also with the demography deficit, but Olena might correct me. I think in Hungary that I also somewhere that there were some kinds of, in relation to certain sectors, where you where that the labor shortages are, that there were some other incentives for the people coming sectors. One of them was in the IT, but I don't remember, I don't recall exactly. So they might be, I mean, one could not erase the kind of the histories also with the, we know that a lot of Ukrainians were working in Czech and in the Skoda, in the factories, and then so there were those kind of, they are in the imaginary of those labor actually. But I think we have a question, unless that Olena, you want to say something? Do you want to add?
Quickly,
Okay.
yes, I really would like to add that in my view, and again, I'm not a political scientist or legal scholar, but really, this is one of the main differences that I agree with Gražina, that this mobility is treated, I mean, these people are treated as labor migrants in terms of reception, in terms of expectations, in terms of even the legal treatment. And in terms of response, we see that literally everywhere after the first reception, they appeared in Germany, in Poland, in Italy, in Hungary. So there were already instructions how to get a job, how not to get, I mean, we see even labor union movements activated in terms of producing leaflets about informing the Ukrainian workers how not to be exploited. We see this in Germany, in Hungary. Temp work agencies responded within weeks saying, we receive families, we receive workers to our plant, we provide special support to our plant. The question is that, demographically speaking, this is not exactly the perfect workers that they have been receiving until now, and this is something that goes back to my earlier comment today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olena. That Randall, and then I take the question from John Dunn from the floor. Yes, yeah. Randall.
I wanted to follow up because it's fascinating, interesting. What was the motivation, though? The burden of the very interesting question from the floor was, we have this long-term population decline. Here's some people, they'll fill gaps. That could be one motivation. The other could be, we don't want to have to pay for these millions of people. Let's get them into the labor market now. The latter, I assume. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And
I just totally follow up on that. But yes, because I think what makes it interesting is that it was not the same perspective in Germany in 2015.
Yes.
So I that's why I started. It's not in the narrative. I don't think anybody wants them to talks about labor deficit, but the way they're treated is very particular. It's different to they are treated as labor migrants at some point.
Yeah, though in the case of the Syrians, the narrative was we've got to integrate these people quickly, get them into language classes, get them in. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And many people were not allowed to work at the beginning, and I mean, you were not made to work, and then now it is actually, there's lots of support in a way, but then you have to find your way, and then you are emplaced as labor, and I think this is very important. From John Dunn from the library, could we hear the question?
Sorry?
Could we hear the question from John Dunn?
Yes, I had three things I wanted to ask you to comment on. One of which has been at least mentioned already, which is the basis on which this particular movement of very large numbers of people has elicited sympathy and very vivid sympathy in a large number of European countries, and obviously also across the Atlantic as well. I think it is very important indeed that actually this is the first really massively destructive war which has been waged largely on camera. The fact is, it's possible to know about this war, about how horrendous it is, in detail, very vividly, in a way it's never been possible to know about a war before. People have known through print media and obviously through other things that absolutely terrible things have been happening in very large numbers of places in the world, but they haven't been able to see and hear them in the way that's been true in this case. And I think that has made an enormous difference to the immediate accessibility of sympathy in the receiving countries. Two other things which are probably quite a lot less important, but I think may matter a bit, are, again, one of these has been emphasized quite a lot already, but it certainly is true that quite a large proportion of the Ukrainians who left did hope to go back. Maybe not, they may have hoped to work a bit and earn some money in the interval, but I think it mostly wasn't the case that people came as sort of focused economic migrants in these numbers at this point in time. I think it's not a credible picture of what happened, and a very large number of the people who came definitely hoped to be able to go back again. And the third thing, which I think is probably important in terms of the asymmetry of response, isn't just general sort of cultural chauvinism, although that certainly is incredibly important. It's that probably quite a lot larger a proportion of the people who arrived from Ukraine were actually able to communicate in a language in the country that they arrived in, or in another country in Europe or in North America to which they could hope to reach.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, that is there anyone who would like to I mean, some of them are the comments, but it is a best covered in a way mediated kind of the war, so that people had that kind of, if I understand you correctly, that it was very people were able to follow it. It's really quote unquote a best covered war in that sense, so that people were exposed to the kind of the horrors of it, and then for that creating that the kind of the sympathy and intention to go back. I mean of course this intention to go back to, I mean, anyone who worked on the labor migrants also, that the first thing they had was that they all wanted to go back to labor migrants also wanted to go back. And for the language issues that I don't know in terms of those kind of the competencies, of course with the neighboring countries might be useful, but Randall wants to pick it up, I think.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting comment, and I agree broadly speaking. Language, I think, was probably less important in the sense that many refugees who arrive in the United Kingdom speak English as a first language if they're from East Africa, for example, or speak English very, very well, and that seems to get them relatively little sympathy, not based from the wonderful Home Secretary at the moment. The other points I think are right. On the temporary element, again, it's the distinction between the primary and the secondary movements. Ukrainian refugees are mostly primary movements to an immediate country, and those people generally all want to. And you go to the neighboring countries, you run like hell until you don't have to run anymore. As soon as you cross the border, you stay there and you hope that you go home. In the case of Europe in 2015, this was a secondary movement. So these were largely people who had given up on Turkey, on Jordan, and Lebanon because of the limited life chances there. So again, I agree, just adding perhaps a bit of nuance. The other issue that made this quite extraordinary is for the, I think, really for the first time since the immediate post-war period, Europeans could say that could have been us. It was the Russian army breaking westwards. It was the nightmare that haunted Europe for 40 years. And I think overnight, a huge number of the Putin-Versteher, those in this country, and in Berlin at the moment, who have this absurd indulgence of Vladimir Putin, that stopped because they realized that Kyiv, that could have been Leipzig, that could have been East Berlin. So I think for Europeans, this war and this refugee complex experience exists on an entirely different level than previous ones. Oh, and last comment, I mean, Germans talk about, they think of their grandparents, these great columns during the Vertreibung, the expulsion of Germans moving westwards. These Ukrainians, they very much thought of their grandmother, their grandfather. So there's a degree of solidity there that, you're right, it's not just cultural chauvinism, could not apply to people from the Middle East coming to Europe.
I think we are, already over our time, but as you see, I think we have to slowly close it, or right away close it. There's some question, but I think we are over our time. I just want to thank all of you for this very interesting and very vivid discussion. I think I learned a lot from you too, and thank you very much. And hopefully we will have a chance to continue in another form, and I'm going forward. Thank you very much for your contributions and for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aisha.